So today's talk is on the Upaddha Sutta, fitting sutta for our last class here. Let me just read the part of the introduction. I'm not going to read the whole introduction. The Upaddha Sutta shows the profound wisdom and skillful compassion of an awakened human being's clear and direct instruction to simply follow what he taught without adaptation, accommodation, or embellishment. He teaches those seeking understanding through his Dhamma to be mindful of the wisdom and singular importance of associating with those that have actually developed his Dhamma. And that's a theme that really runs, and I'll say it in the next sentence. The Buddha constantly and consistently taught the importance of wise associations, both internally, meaning what we hold in mind, meaning each factor of the Eightfold Path, but also within our Dhamma practice, the importance of wise associations. And that's what he's teaching Ananda in this sutta. The Upaddha Sutta provides guidance on this underlying theme running throughout the Buddha's Dhamma. Ananda, the Buddha's cousin and chief attendant, is confused about the importance of wise associations and friendships as a Dhamma practitioner. The Buddha teaches Ananda that fidelity to the Buddha's Dhamma is the guiding framework for associations and friendships within Dhamma practice. So it doesn't mean that we, as Dhamma practitioners, we should never talk to or interact with people that aren't strict Dhamma practitioners. It just means as Dhamma practitioners, we develop the Dhamma and associate ourselves with those that are actually practicing the Dhamma. The Buddha describes the results of associating himself with contradictory self-referential views, ignorant of Four Noble Truths, in the Nagara Sutta. That's a sutta where the Buddha describes his own awakening. It was not until he was able to recognize and abandon these internal associations to wrong views that he was able to rightly self-awaken. And that's that phrase, rightly self-awaken, is how he referred to himself, someone who actually did the work themselves and came to their own conclusions that supported their awakening. And then he taught everyone else that they too could also rightly self-awaken, meaning we're not dependent on any outside force, any type of ritual, a higher being, or a higher spiritual system to awaken. It's simply by developing the Eightfold Path without embellishment. Through his own rightly self-awakening, Siddhartha Gautama, now a Buddha, developed a profound understanding of the conditions that all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing disappointing and unsatisfactory experiences originated in and were dependent on for continuation. This commonly misunderstood and misapplied teaching is known as dependent origination. The Paticca-Samuppada Sutta is the primary sutta on dependent origination. That sutta provides the foundational context for the Buddha's entire Dhamma. It is continued ignorance of this foundational teaching arising from an aversion to the Buddha's actual Dhamma that results in a subtle craving for and clinging to new or novel ideas in an ever-changing, contradictory, and confusing modern Buddhism. So think about a mind that's rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths creates very powerful and very subtle strategies to continue to ignore its own ignorance. And that happens within that happens within all societal systems, but in particular, it happens within Buddhism right from the time of the Buddha's teaching, even while he was teaching his Dhamma. I think it was last Saturday, we talked about the Devadatta Sutta, where the Buddha's own cousin was so consumed with his own ignorance and need for self-establishment that he conspired twice to try to kill the Buddha, his cousin, and take over the Sangha to establish himself in the world as some great spiritual teacher. That need for constant self-establishment, the need to continue our own self-referential views, is the primary reason why people that come to the Buddha's Dhamma reject it, because they want it to be more. They want it to be different. They want the Dhamma to allow for ignorance to continue in effect. And that's happened with here in the Sangha. There's been many, this is just people's choices, but people have said, if the Buddha was alive today, he would teach something completely different. Well, you can only come to that conclusion when you don't understand what the Buddha actually taught, that it's timeless. The Four Noble Truths reflect a common underlying human condition that is rooted in ignorance of those truths. Let me continue. Is that clear though? And that we all do that. We do it within Buddhism, and we also do it in our own lives. We don't want to take complete responsibility for the stress that we're creating in our own lives by not seeing things clearly. Yeah. Good. The need to provide novel insight to thirsty practitioners provides continued distraction from developing the specific insight into 3 marks of existence, framed by 4 noble truths as taught by the Buddha. That's what the Buddha taught. A very specific insight is to be gained through the Dhamma, and that is insight into the permanence of all things, the not self-characteristic anatta. And lacking that, we will continually be stuck in a state of stress or suffering, or a state of dukkha. By gaining insight into the impermanence of all things, particularly in the impermanence of our own views, rooted in ignorance of those 4 noble truths, we awaken. But it has to be that very specific insight. It's not insight into, well, let me read this because I explain it in the next section. The Buddha was free of self-identification and the ego-driven need to be recognized as a renowned spiritual leader. He knew that the number of followers he may have did not legitimize his Dhamma. He understood that the well-defined focus of his Dhamma would not appeal to everyone. Remember in the Vipassana Sutta, where the Buddha, upon his awakening, considered for a few more weeks if it was even possible to teach what he understood, and if it wouldn't simply be a waste of his time and, in the translated words, tiresome for him to do that. And after careful consideration, he came to the conclusion that there were enough people, there were people with just a speck of dust in their eyes, meaning they weren't so deeply rooted in ignorance that there was no way that they could understand his Dhamma. Just a little speck of dust in their eyes that they would be able to develop his Dhamma. And so that's who he was teaching, because he understood that he was not a savior. His Dhamma was not meant to be salvific in nature. It was simply meant to teach those that were willing to learn. The Buddha taught to those with just a little dust in their eyes. His only concern with teaching his Dhamma was to be clear, consistent, accessible, and most importantly, highly effective. And he knew that by watering it down in any way to make it appeal to the masses would end any effectiveness in developing awakening. And it's something that he consistently came up against and was asked to do by many people and consistently refused to do it. It's interesting that as soon as the Buddha passed, there were people within the Sangha that couldn't wait to start adapting and accommodating and embellishing his Dhamma. Through his own noble search for understanding, he encountered many different and ineffective spiritual practices. Rather than becoming distracted from his goal by associating with his many different practices, he remained committed within himself to discovering a path that directly develops insight and understanding of the human condition and a calm mind free of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. Upon his awakening, having united his mind with his body, Siddhartha had an intricate knowledge of the singular importance of useful and refined mindfulness. He knew that what is held in mind internally is reflected in external associations. The Buddha understood that what is held in mind will describe and determine one's Dhamma practice and ongoing life experience. A mind distracted from the insatiable need towards continual self-identification will constantly crave for new and novel ideological spiritual philosophies and ever-evolving dharmas. It must be modern. It must reflect what's going on in the world. What is really saying that any dharma that I'll associate with must allow me to continue to ignore my own ignorance. It must fit my views. And the problem is wrong views. The Buddha understood through his own noble search that grasping after and clinging on to any and every ideological conceptual philosophy or ritualistic practice was a result of a mind lacking clear direction and concentration. Much of the modern mindfulness and insight practices teach that mindfulness is to be constantly aware of ever-changing phenomena. This is a subtle form of clinging awareness that dismisses the refined mindfulness taught by an awakened human being. Rather than teach mindfulness as a practice of simply engaging in clinging awareness of fleeting common events, the refined mindfulness that the Buddha teaches resolves the subtle conceit arising in a mind ignorant of Four Noble Truths. what all of that means is that we, as those seeking understanding, have an ongoing choice. And that choice is, as Dhamma practitioners, to associate ourselves, to be mindful of what an awakened human being actually taught or not. And by the way, there's not a right or wrong choice there, unless we want to awaken within the Buddha's teaching. Do you understand the clear distinction I'm making there? People aren't wrong if they decide they want to practice some other form of Buddhism. But if you want to practice what an awakened human being actually taught, you practice what a human being actually taught. And that is very clear and easily accessible. But you have to follow what the Buddha taught again. And one of the most remarkable things in my life, and that I discovered as a general Buddhist practitioner, was that those teachings are still here today, and they're contained in the Sutta Pitaka. That's why you'll never find a teaching that I give that isn't founded in an actual sutta. I don't teach concepts. I don't teach what I hope something people want to hear. I don't teach that we should all be wonderful. We should. But I also understand that we can't all be wonderful all the time, because our minds are rooted in ignorance of how to do that, unless we develop an eightfold path. And so that's the distinction. That's the distinction I'm making in this introduction. And it's the distinction that the Buddha gives Ananda. You'll see if I ever get to it. It is recognizing and abandoning the suffering that follows this subtle conceit, meaning I-making, within a distracting and ever-changing environment, whether it's within Buddhism or not, that is the essence of the refined mindfulness taught by the Buddha. Again, the Buddha is teaching us to take our minds that are always grasping for something new and novel to establish ourselves, and practice restraint and focus our minds, meaning develop concentration, so that we can hold in mind this very narrow and distinct path to awakening. And he did this over and over. You can read this direction in almost every sutta, even if it's not explicit, because he had this profound understanding. It's what he awakened to, that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing suffering. And upon his awakening again, he considered, how do I pierce that veil of ignorance? Because he knew how strong it was, how powerful people wanted to maintain ignorance of the way life really is. And so that is why he taught, and the only reason he taught, the Eightfold Path, which is the only path he ever taught, for that specific reason. Mindfulness, as the Buddha teaches mindfulness, is to be mindful of each factor of the Eightfold Path. This refined mindfulness is known as the heartwood of the Dhamma. This refined mindfulness brings great freedom from entanglements with others who inadvertently or intentionally are practicing contradictory and distracting dharmas. This refined mindfulness provides gentle and continuous guidance towards awakening. Awakening with this refined, associating with this refined mindfulness, and those that are themselves associated with this refined mindfulness, is what the Buddha is teaching Ananda and all Dhamma practitioners. During Siddhartha Gautama's noble search for understanding, he recognized and avoided unskillful dharmas and associations that would have otherwise distracted him from developing the profound wisdom rooted in understanding Four Noble Truths. So in the Aryapariyasana Sutta and other suttas, you remember me talking about Siddhartha's encounter with Alara Kalama and Udeka Ramaputta, two of the most renowned spiritual teachers of his time, who both begged the Buddha to come and represent them in their teachings, which would have been, for most people, it would have been an almost irresistible possibility, because it would have immediately established himself as one of the great spiritual teachers in northern India at the time. But he knew that he wasn't after that. He had already greatly diminished an ego-driven self. He was seeking understanding, not continual ways that was continue to establish himself in the world as any type of person. He simply wanted to develop understanding. So he rejected those teachings and many other teachers that he encountered over those 6 years of searching, because they simply didn't lead to the goal. And he had a very subtle understanding of establishing a self in a non-physical realm, which was explicitly what both of these teachers taught. But he also understood the very subtle form of imaginary self-establishment, meaning whenever we establish ourselves in any type of ideology. Lorna had a good example this morning as being a great dog trainer. When that becomes a defining characteristic of our lives, how we define ourselves to ourselves, that's an establishment in a non-physical realm. Even though you might actually be doing dog training, it's in your mind that you're imagining the establishment of that. That's establishment in an ideological, non-physical realm. And that's something the Buddha knew intimately as simply continued eye making. And so having that discussion we had this morning, it doesn't mean that you don't enjoy being a dog trainer or whatever else you might be doing. It simply doesn't define who you are anymore.
But doesn't not defining yourself in the non-physical realm, anytime you're not with your body, that's what you're doing.
Exactly.
All this thinking and imagining conversations we're having with people and all that sort of stuff, and what's going to happen throughout the day before it, all that thinking is establishing yourself in a non-physical realm.
All of it. It's all going on in your head. And that's it, when you take just a moment to think about it, that's what you're thinking about. And any type of projection into the future is doing the same thing. But it takes a bit of concentration to see yourself objectifying yourself in that situation tomorrow, next year, next month, whatever it might be. It's happening in your mind, isn't it? It's a non-physical experience. And so the obvious non-physical establishments in giving mystical terms, such as infinite consciousness or infinite space, or within the Dhamma, you'll often hear establishment in the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, or the common misunderstanding of the environment of nothingness or emptiness. Those are all establishments in non-physical realms that the Buddha realized is just a distraction. So, doing that, engaging in any practice that encourages establishing yourself in a non-physical ideological realm, even as the realm of being the primary modern Buddhist path is the Bodhisattva path. The Bodhisattva path is a path that is defined by seeking enlightenment solely for the benefit of all other beings, or a variant on that is, I will delay my own awakening until all other human beings or all of the sentient beings are awakened. We know that that's impossible if you follow the Buddha's teaching. It's not possible to wait for everyone to be awakened. It sounds very altruistic and even compassionate on its surface, doesn't it? But it's simply establishing your Buddhist practice now in an ideological, non-physical realm. And in effect, you really don't have to do anything in that path except be nice to people, which is a good thing to do, but it doesn't lead anybody towards awakening. It doesn't address the problem of ignorance of Four Noble Truths. Is that clear? Is it? So anytime we try to establish ourselves in any way, rather than recognize the eye-making in that, we take to the Dhamma because we see ourselves doing it and just continue practice. And we come to very subtle levels of understanding in that way of the process of our own process of doing that, continually self-establishing. Choosing wise associations to support Dhamma practice is as important today as it was 2,600 years ago. Choosing wise associations to support Dhamma practice is perhaps more difficult today, given the extent of the many contradictory and popular modern dharmas. What the Buddha is teaching Ananda is that merely associating with other Buddhists does not establish an authentic, skillful, effective, or complete Dhamma practice. Unskillful association is a somewhat subtle form of continued eye-making. Self-identification with social groups is common and widespread, resulting in a confusing melting pot of conceptual views and ideas, often contradictory and often dismissive of the Buddha's Dhamma. That's a pretty strong statement, I know, that I'm making, but I'm making it from my own personal experience of doing just that and creating identities within whatever group I might have been associated with at the time. Given legitimacy by common agreement, pleasant distraction, and ongoing avoidance of an awakened human being's actual teachings, the modern social Sangha now establishes and continually reinforces an ever-changing view of what Buddhist practice is or should be. This is a modern Buddhism by common agreement. And that last line, Buddhism by common agreement, reflects something that the Buddha said 2,600 years ago in a statement that he made to a group called the Kalamas in the Kalama Sutta. And one of the lines is, and this was a group of people that were confused by all the different spiritual teachers that would come through. They lived on a major trade route that would come through their area, each one proclaiming that their Dharma was the one complete and true Dharma, follow them. And so the Buddha arrives and they said, well, why should we follow you? How do we know? How do we pick and choose? How do we know the right one? And the Buddha gave a rather long talk that I'll synopsize by saying, don't go by others' accounts, don't go by common agreement, et cetera, et cetera. Learn for yourself. Take to this Dhamma, practice it, ehepasiko, and then decide its effectiveness. And in effect, he's saying, don't just listen to me, practice the Dhamma, and then you'll know. And so that's why I'm referring to Buddhism by common agreement, which is what most of modern Buddhism is. It's a melting pot, a hodgepodge of different ideas that come together that may or may not have any relevance to what the Buddha actually taught, and that now becomes a so-called Buddhist practice. And the only difficulty with that is if you do that, you're associating with yourself with something that's not likely to develop awakening. I'm going to skip over the rest of the introduction and get to the sutta. But I think that it's important to understand the foundation of where this came from, because this problem of Dhamma as common agreement was just as common during the Buddhist time as it was today. The Upaddha Sutta. On one occasion, the Buddha was staying with the Sakyans in Sakkara. Venerable Ananda had a question for his teacher. He approached the Buddha, bowed, and sat to one side. Is it true that having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is half of the well-integrated life? When I use the term well-integrated, the usual translations are holy. But that, to me, has too many religious connotations that I don't think the Buddha intended. But the root of holy means, it really doesn't mean anything religious. It does mean complete. And so what the Buddha is referring to is a well-integrated Dhamma practitioner. The Buddha responds, don't ever say that, Ananda. Having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is the whole of the well-integrated life. And many people who even refer to this will stop right there and then make a Buddhist practice as simply having spiritual friends, saying, well, that's all that I have to do is associate with people that are so-called spiritual or put Buddhist labels on things. The practitioner of my Dhamma, who has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues, can now be expected to avoid distraction arising from unskillful associations and pursue and fully develop the Noble Eightfold Path. That's the important part there. They have fully developed the Eightfold Path. That defines one as an admirable friend or colleague or companion within the Dhamma. Listen carefully, Ananda, and I will tell you precisely how a practitioner of my Dhamma, who has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues, avoids distraction and pursues and fully develops the Noble Eightfold Path. This Dhamma practitioner develops right view that is dependent on seclusion, dependent on dispassion, dependent on cessation, that results in relinquishment. And it's very specific relinquishment. It's relinquishment of wrong views, or views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. They also develop right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation, that are all dependent on seclusion, dependent on dispassion, dependent on cessation, and all that results in relinquishment. 3 times in the beginning of this sutta, the Buddha is telling Ananda that wise associations is with people that are developing the Eightfold Path. This is how a practitioner of my Dhamma who has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues avoids distraction and pursues and fully develops the Noble Eightfold Path. It is only through fidelity to my Dhamma that one may know that having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of a well-integrated life. It is only by associating with those types of people, with people that have actually developed the Eightfold Path. That's why I keep coming back to how remarkable it is that this Sangha has actually done that, and we've stuck to it. And that's something unique and rare that the Buddha emphasized over and over again, and including in the sutta 2,600 years ago, how important it was. Now, remember the setting. He's teaching Ananda, who has a fairly complete understanding of the Dhamma. He is the Buddha's cousin. He's been with him throughout the Buddha's teaching career. Excuse me. And he's the Buddha's constant companion, his attendant. And yet Ananda's still in that environment where there's other people talking about other dharmas that they want to associate with the Buddha's Dhamma. And he becomes confused. So he asks this question again of his cousin. And the Buddha continually points Ananda back to the framework of the Eightfold Path, the only path he ever taught. This is such an important part here because, well, here's the Buddha's words. It is first in dependence on me as an admirable friend that those being subject to birth gain release from being subject to birth, that those being subject to aging gain release from being subject to aging, that those being subject to sickness gain release from being subject to sickness, that those being subject to death gain release from being subject to death. Dependence on me as an admirable friend. The Buddha's, again, he's not setting himself up as somebody superhuman. He's already described what an admirable friend is. It's someone who is well integrated in the Eightfold Path. In dependence of him as an admirable friend, as someone who understands the Eightfold Path. And then the rest of this reference is to the arising of suffering, as the Buddha describes it. It is in dependence on me as an admirable friend that those being subject to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair have gained release from sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair. It is in dependence on the Buddha as a human being who has fully developed the Eightfold Path that we are able to gain release from the suffering as the Buddha did. Is that clear? Is it clear why the Buddha is making that statement? Yes.
I think there's kind of like a fine line coming out here. I mean, the Sangha members who want to establish themselves in other realms are really chasing the 5 clinging aggregates.
Yeah, that's right.
They're just chasing 5 clinging aggregates.
Yeah.
But you also, when you want a Sangha member to look to the Buddha for teachings, for knowledge, for release, aren't you also chasing 5 clinging aggregates?
A great question. It points to the need for refined mindfulness, and it's really what the Buddha is talking about. Because of a mind that wants to, a mind, the 5 clinging aggregates describe a mind rooted in ignorance. the personal experience of ongoing suffering. A mind rooted in that is constantly grasping after new and novel ways to ignore the fact that it's suffering. And so the Buddha teaches, and this is why the Buddha taught a meditation method solely for the purpose of deepening concentration, so that we can support the integration, as he's teaching here, of the Eightfold Path, to recognize that. And so we have to take a mind that is associating with wrong views, needs something, and in this case it's an Eightfold Path, to associate with to develop right view, to recognize and abandon wrong view. And you're right, it is a fine line. And that's why it's so easy to cross that line into distraction and associate with dharmas or other dharmic practices that are merely distractions, even though it might feel good. In fact, precisely because it feels good. It's precisely because something is distracting or it is commonly agreed on that gives it legitimacy, because this is what I want to do. You know, and I hear that often, that even here, that people will say, well, I do this part of this teacher's practice, and I use this and I do that, and I bring all these different singular aspects of different dharmas, different Buddhist lineages, and I bring them all into one because that's what I agree with. That's what makes me feel good. That's fine. But what you're doing is you're substituting or avoiding the Buddha's Dhamma so that you can continue the 5 clinging aggregates. Does that explain what your fine line?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the difference, but in pinning your own thinking down and tracing your own thinking and tracing the root of your own thinking, apart from just through knowledge, I understand the difference of what you're seeking, but I don't. You know, without the overall knowledge, it doesn't make sense. But with the overall knowledge, it does make sense. But when you're tracing your own thinking back, there's a very fine line.
Oh yeah.
Because this all comes from the same thought.
And so.
So it's kind of when you trace it right down, it just goes to a mush.
Yeah, it does, because there's nothing of substance there, yeah. like foam on the water. And so a well-concentrated mind, having integrated the Eightfold Path, is not focused on where it came from. It's focused on what's occurring in my mind right now. And that points to really what we talked about Thursday night, the meaning of becoming. In this moment, the Buddha's Dhamma shows that each and every moment holds the potential to either awaken or continue ignorance. And so it is that fine line. Am I going to continue to integrate and hold in mind the Eightfold Path? And that's what the Buddha is teaching Ananda here and all of us. Or am I going to do something else? And it might be something that we call Buddhist practice. It might be something that we call something else. It doesn't really matter. If we're looking at it as part of my path to awakening, and it's not this, it's going to be distracting. It's only going to continue 5 clinging aggregates. And that's the whole point of wise associations.
Isn't everything else, John, just without right view? Everything else is essentially, it could be noble, it could be kind, but without right view, it's not what the Buddha is teaching.
Yes, exactly. And so people have difficulty with this because it sounds very exclusive. But remember, the Buddha didn't teach an exclusive Dhamma. He simply wanted to teach something that was effective. And he taught it to everyone who was interested. During the Buddha's time, there was, and still today in India, there's a caste system. And you could not teach anything to people in the lower classes. And anything. You couldn't teach them how to cook. But certainly you couldn't teach them spiritual things. And the penalty for doing so was you would be put to death. But the Buddha said, my Dhamma is for everyone. So there wasn't anything exclusive, except that he understood that this was a narrow path that wouldn't appeal to everyone. He wasn't concerned, again, about being a great spiritual teacher. Jen had her hand up.
Like a paragraph or two before the one you're on now in the Buddha's words, you were reading about what release is dependent on, the Buddha said it is dependent on.
Seclusion, dispassion.
Yeah,
and
what were the other ones?
Seclusion, dispassion, and
Relinquishment was the last one.
Yes, letting go of wrong views.
But there was a couple more in there.
there's one more. It was seclusion, dispassion, and
It was concentration, I believe. So what the Buddha's
No, I just like wanted to hear it again.
Oh.
Because it helped.
think
It helped me focus on what the point he's getting to.
yes.
Is that if that
Yes.
makes sense? I'm sorry. It was.
no, let me find
It
it.
was a poor segue from what Lorna was saying.
It relates to the jhanas as well, because the first
Yes.
one is the joy and rapture born of seclusion, and the next well, I guess eventually, what was the second one you said?
Dispassion.
Dispassion,
Yeah, passion.
and then eventually the equanimity.
Release.
Because I feel
This-
like that to me is like somehow I just feel like the Buddha is saying this is what you have to focus on, right?
Yeah.
And
Let me read it.
everything else is compost.
Yes, again,
and it's
he's
so
teaching-
easy to get in that compost, and I just need to like hear it
And-
again and be like, this is what I have to concentrate on.
and through unskillful associations, we're stuck in
Right.
compost.
So easy, yes.
This Dhamma practitioner develops right view that is dependent on seclusion. And again, dependent on seclusion refers to the Buddha's teachings on meditation. And it's not just physical seclusion, although that's of primary importance. It's also the secluding our mind
It's this, right?
from anything that is
Yeah,
distracting.
meditate,
Yes.
retreat, yeah.
And that it's also seclusion in that case is metaphor for deepening jhana. Dependent on seclusion, dependent on dispassion. Dispassion, remember in the fire discourse, passion is the ongoing fire that fuels constant self-identification,
Which is
constant
all over the
I-making.
place if you're not sitting with your Dhamma, if you're not sitting with your Sangha.
Yep. Again, that you're absolutely right. Dependent on cessation
Cessation.
Cessation, yes.
and results in relinquishment. And it also refers directly to Four Noble Truths, doesn't it? When you see it this way.
Kevin, I
So-
need an acronym.
Hmm?
I need an acronym
For what?
for those four things.
Well, let me continue, because even though this is now further on, from those that have gained release in this manner, from dependence on me, but when the Buddha is saying dependence on me, he's really saying dependence on his Dhamma. From dependence on me, can one know how having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of a well-integrated life. From dependence on the Dhamma itself, and associating with those that depend on the Dhamma itself, we now have wise associations. And again, remember the setting. I'm going to skip over some of my comments.
John,
Yeah, yes, please. That's the end of the sutta.
just kind of speaking to what David touched on, and also what John was saying. The Dhamma is the Dhamma. That's it. It's not something else. So just the context of the Dhamma is narrow, and it's clearly outlined in Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path. It's very clear. For householders like ourselves, there's lots of other things that we do in our lives that aren't the Dhamma. Okay? The Dhamma is the Dhamma. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So if I could expand on that, it doesn't mean we don't do anything else but meditate and read the suttas, although I kind of do that. But it does mean that as those seeking the understanding of a Buddha, we keep our focus narrow and on what the Buddha taught. And again, one of the reasons why I read suttas like this is to hear the Buddha's words on how important it is. In fact, I could say singularly important. He's telling Ananda, his cousin, his chief attendant, that if you want to, even you, Ananda, if you want to continue to develop awakening, you need to maintain this narrow focus. Because it's only with that narrow, well-focused mind that you can avoid unskillful associations with different ideas, different dharmas, different social groups or sanghas, and simply remain focused on awakening. Kevin.
I'm curious as to what you think Ananda's practice was like. Was he more involved in the duties of being the attendant, or was he, his practice himself, right? What was he doing when he was sleeping and when he got up before he went to attend to the Buddha? I mean, what was he doing? What type of practice did he have? Or was he just showing up and doing his duties?
No, he
was his own practice. I'm just curious.
He had a very, one of these days I'm going to give maybe before the end of the year, I'm going to give a talk on Ananda and describe his life as best as I can from taking out of the suttas. But he was a 100% committed Dhamma practitioner. And, that was,
Monk.
and so, pardon me?
A monk in the Sangha.
Oh yeah. And so what that entailed during the Buddha's lifetime, during Ananda's lifetime, was that you spent a rather structured life with time for meditation and time to take care of your needs. You went into town every day, got your bowl of food, you went on your arms around. You might have spent some time sewing your rags together to keep your robes, keep clothes on your back. You'd probably spend a little bit of time taking care of your hut or wherever you were sleeping. He attended to the Buddha's needs at the same time, although Siddhartha went into town almost every day himself. And then he would often listen to his cousin, the Buddha, give a talk every day, or some of the other ones. He might spend some time listening to Sariputta or Moggallana give a talk, but he was completely immersed in the Dhamma. You remember the story that it wasn't until a month after the Buddha passed that Ananda gained full understanding, and he finally awakened. But he always had this thirst for, and reflected in this question, for awakening.
Did he have too much attachment to both Sariputta and the Buddha?
Well, that's a great question.
Was that a hindrance to his awakening because he was so devoted to and admiring of? I've often wondered, like, it was after the passing of, he was dismayed by both of their deaths. And
yeah, Sariputta died right before the Buddha did. Yeah, that's some great insight. It may be that he was he had too much bodhisattva in him to awaken earlier. I can put it that way. He was so concerned with taking care of his cousin and the Buddha and Sariputta and attending to the needs of the Sangha. I mean, that's certainly possible. It's hard to say entirely, but he was a completely devoted Dhamma practitioner too. It also points to something else, that we can get impatient after being well-focused Dhamma practitioners for a few years and not quite awakening yet. We shouldn't. The great freedom that comes from really integrating the Eightfold Path is knowing that you're doing everything you can and that the end is certain. We know that. We know that as long as we continue to practice the Eightfold Path the way it's intended, we will awaken. How do we know it? Because other human beings have done it, and an awakened human being said, we will too. Just do this. But we have to do it wholeheartedly. We have to be, we have to have the courage to say, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do that because there's so many distractions around. Again, that's what the Buddha's teaching Ananda. It's something that we have developed in a remarkable way here at Cross River Meditation Center. So I thought this would be an appropriate sutta to end here and kick us down the road a little bit. So, but I will go, let's go around the room and see if you have any questions or comments, and then we'll finish it up. Lorna, good to see you this morning.
Thank you for your teaching. I really don't have anything else to add. You've answered my questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Matt, my friend.
Good to be here. Good to be here with everyone. Thank you for your teaching. This is great. Good to close this chapter.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to speak for myself, and I'm sure John too. How joyful this Sangha makes me, and how joyful the Buddha's Dhamma makes me. So thank you all for sharing that with me.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. David, good to see you this morning.
I have nothing to add, Joe. Just thank you. I think Ananda represents all of us.
Yeah.
Some so devoted, but there's more work to be done. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Mary Beth, good to see you this morning.
Thank you, John. And I am happy to be here. Just sitting in the room with everyone.
Yeah.
It's a great experience for me. And the conversation was perfect and great, but also just feel like I'm at a bit of a transitional point in my life in terms of just like who I want to spend my time with. And because I mean, there's just so much endlessness to do and opportunities, and I don't know, this has just helped me to kind of almost be a touchstone of like, yeah, like this is a great place for me to be, a great use of my time, and like uncertain moving forward of who I really want to be friends with and who my time associated with whatever. I hope that it's a good conversation to come back to.
Yeah, thank you for putting it that way. It is, the Dhamma is a touchstone. It's an anchor into reality if we want it to be that way. And choosing ever wiser associations is simply a reflection of that. Like the Buddha says, that what we hold in mind internally is going to be reflected externally. And it doesn't mean that this group of people is something wrong or bad or evil. It's just not conducive to where I'm going in my life, towards my own awakening. What is more important, than that, than developing awakening as the Buddha teaches it. So glad you're here this morning. Jen, good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, so this idea has like first kind of I became aware of this idea of associations first when I learned about right livelihood.
Mm.
And it was really confusing when I felt like, and it was I was resistant to it because it felt like judgy and I felt like, I couldn't have certain associations that were outside. I couldn't have associations outside of Dhamma unless, if I wanted to awaken, that was impossible. It was just how my mind was hearing it, But this time hearing it, it was just like laser right in there. Like, no, this is just so you can stay concentrated. You have to have these people that help you stay concentrated. And from, day one, it was always like, everybody here was, I always felt like a little, just like a little ping pong ball. And everybody was like, the circle around me just being like, no, just stay with you. Stop trying to be something else, So, yeah, it's brought it home. This talk, so thank you.
Thank you. Greg, good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you, John. Very good. I'm very happy. I went through my absolute mess of emails and saw that this was going to be the last class here, and not that I'm happy it's the last class here, that I'm happy I read that and was able to be here. It's interesting how fragile. I was coming very regularly Tuesdays or Thursdays, work schedule changes, and boom, it's like off the table.
Yeah.
So how fragile that was really something to deal with. Trying to maintain the practice when I got into a regular schedule and a nice flow, and to not forget that places can move, times can change, but the Dhamma is always there. It's always accessible. The fact that you have all these online resources, and it's so much more than any room, and it's I remember walking in here not too long ago, and it was since that day things have changed very rapidly, very drastically for the better. And, I just need to hear things put the right way, and this place and not just this physical location, but the whole everything, the Sangha, and it's been really awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. I'm glad you're here today. Becky, good to see you.
Good to be here too. I don't really have a lot to add, just in total agreement with everyone that this is a touchstone, and it's important to be with these people in this setting. You can, for me, if I'm here, then I can continue when I'm not here to access the Dhamma by reading, by meditating. But if I don't have this experience of being here, then that becomes more and more difficult. So this really is the touchstone, and I'm so happy that it's here. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm pretty happy it's here too. And now there. So. Kevin, good to see you.
Hi, John. Nice to see everybody this morning. I was listening to something this week. I'm not going to mention what it was, but it was speaking about honoring teachings and teachers and original teachings, and how throughout history that is humans have not really done that in a lot of different contexts, and it sort of, I felt it coming through in this sutta, I was just about honoring original teachings and honoring teachers, and I think that every one of us here has particularly dedicated ourselves to honoring the three jewels, and I want to take a moment to thank our teachers and honor you, and that's you and that, and honor the Dhamma as we do by practicing, and honoring the Sangha as we do by showing up. And there's a particular responsibility, as the Buddha often says, rightly self-awakened, and that is turning directly back on you. There's an honor yourself as a student. Learn the Dhamma. To the point where you can integrate it into your life and embody it, and that's a subtle teaching that you're putting out there. Not that we're all trying to be teachers, but that's a whole other conversation that may be developing around here. But honoring yourself as a student and honoring the teaching, honoring the teacher, that's really important. And just want to thank everybody for providing that space to do that. And I know this is just a room, we've often said that, but I'd like to play the fine line as also that it's been more than a room for me and for other people in here, and it's been really special to be a part of. So while it is just a space and we will be moving, this is a special space, and I want everybody to remember that, and I wanted to thank everybody for being a part of that, particularly my involvement here. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for being a part of it. I didn't get to this part in the introduction. Please read it, but it talks about, as Dharma practitioners, we do have, just to use a heavy word, a grave responsibility to be true exemplars of the Dhamma. And that is, as the Buddha is pointing out to Ananda, that is the whole of Dhamma practice, which means that if I really, and you hear me say it in this way, the most loving thing I can do for myself and all other sentient beings is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. Because what's more important for all of humanity? The Buddha realized that. He also realized that it wasn't going to be for everyone, but I do have a responsibility. And that responsibility has guided how I've taught these classes. You know, just that. That's why I only teach what the Buddha taught, you know, because it's the only way that, and I realized this a long time ago, it's the only way that I know to keep myself as much as I possibly can out of it. Because then I'm just teaching something else. All right, then I'm just teaching another Buddhism by common agreement, or at least what I want it to be. So thank you. Liz, good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be here. I don't have anything to add. Everyone has been so aware of everything that we need to do to be representational of the Sangha and the Dhamma. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Bonnie, welcome. I'm glad you made it.
I'm sorry I came late, but I wanted to be part of helping to move
Oh, thank
the
you.
space, because it's been such an important space for me. So
Yeah.
grateful to everyone.
I'm glad you made it, and thank you for coming. So, yeah, I think it was a fitting sutta for our last class here and going down the road. What Kevin was talking about, really what we're all talking about, what has made this place remarkable is all of us grounded in the Dhamma. You know, this wasn't just another social engagement for any of us, I don't think, and that's really what made it effective and special in that way. So we're going to take it down the road. And I can't thank all of you enough to let me be part of your Sangha. I know I got this seat here, but there's not one of you that I wouldn't want to associate with, especially within the Dhamma. And it's because of your wholehearted engagement and commitment to just this and not that really has made this so fulfilling for me. So thank you. Okay, class is over. So those that are here, if you can stay and help us move out, thank you for that. I understand if you can't. Pardon me? Oh, yeah, we always finish with Metta. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, we're not done yet. So again, thank you, Lorna. This is how a Sangha works. Yeah. I've made a decision, and I'm going to get down to the new place. I can't wait for impermanence to intervene. Let's find our relaxed meditative posture. Gently close your eyes, gently close your mouths, and take a moment to become mindful of your in-breath and your out-breath. And these are the Buddha's words on Metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing, in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class this morning. Peace. So